A woman is dead on a Minneapolis street. 3 gunshots, 2 videos, and a story declared clear almost instantly. Federal officials said the threat was obvious. They said the officer was justified. They said the case, in essence, was settled. But slow the footage down, frame by frame. A car stands still, then moves. An officer steps forward. Commands are shouted. A weapon is drawn. In democracies, these moments matter, because force, once used, demands explanation. Not slogans, not speed, but truth. I've reported from places where power explains itself after the fact, where certainty arrives before evidence, and where accountability quietly disappears. If you care about how authority works in America today, stay with me. Because before we ask who was right, before we argue justification, we have to confront a more basic question. What actually happened here? And who now controls that answer? To understand this case, we have to slow everything down, strip away the statements, strip away the politics, and focus on what is actually in dispute. This is not just about a shooting. It is about a sequence of decisions made in seconds by agents operating with federal authority. At the center is a single encounter between Renee Nicole Good and ICE officers, an encounter we do not fully see and do not fully understand. Federal officials describe a dangerous situation. A vehicle used as a weapon, an officer facing imminent harm. But video complicates that story, and silence deepens the uncertainty. We still do not know why she was stopped, what legal authority was being exercised, or what the officers intended to do next. These unanswered questions are not technical details. They are the foundation of accountability. And to grasp why they matter so much, we need to step back and look at how we arrived at this moment. This moment did not appear out of nowhere. It sits inside a longer story, one shaped by policy shifts, by enforcement priorities, and by a widening gap between federal power and local oversight. ICE operations have become more visible, more assertive, and more politically charged. Agents are tasked with targeted missions, often fast, often under pressure, often in public spaces not designed for arrests. That changes the risk for officers and for civilians. At the same time, immigration enforcement has moved closer to daily life. Parking lots, residential streets, ordinary neighborhoods. When enforcement expands outward, so does friction, confusion, and the chance that routine encounters escalate. This is where procedure matters most. Clear authority, clear commands, clear limits on force. When any of those blur, seconds become decisive. And in Minneapolis, those seconds would soon collapse into a crisis. Then everything accelerates. The vehicle is stopped in the roadway, not fleeing, not charging, waiting. Time stretches nearly 3 minutes. Cars pass. Gestures are exchanged. Then 2 agents step out. One moves to the driver's side, fast, close. The other walks directly in front of the vehicle, into its path. Commands are shouted out of the car. Again and again, the vehicle moves, first backward, then forward. A weapon is drawn. A moment of contact is possible. Unclear, disputed. Then the shots. 1, 2, 3. The car pulls away, crashes nearby, and the encounter is over. This is the instant everyone now debates, the instant officials point to, the instant that ends a life. If you want to understand how force becomes fatal, this is where attention matters most. Because beneath the chaos, a deeper mechanism is already at work. What looks like chaos is often structure at work. Behind this moment sits a set of rules, training manuals, use of force policies, unwritten habits formed over years. law enforcement is taught to control space, distance, angles. Vehicles change that equation. They compress time, they magnify fear. That is why policy exists. To slow instinct, to guide judgment, officers are trained not to stand in front of moving vehicles, because once you do, every outcome becomes worse. Deadly force is allowed only under narrow conditions. Imminent threat, no reasonable alternative. These rules are not abstract. They are designed to prevent exactly this kind of moment. But when operations are rushed, when environments are unpredictable, and when authority is asserted without clarity, policy becomes fragile. In those seconds, training competes with memory, with past danger, with fear, and when that balance breaks, the consequences are irreversible, which brings us to the second crisis, one that unfolds not on the street, but inside the system itself. The second crisis begins quietly, not with gunfire, but with control over the investigation, control over the narrative, control over who is allowed to ask questions. Almost immediately, federal authorities take charge. The FBI assumes control of the case. State investigators step back, not by choice, but by force of jurisdiction. Minnesota officials say they are blocked, removed from the process. This matters more than it sounds, because investigations are not just about evidence. They are about trust and perception. When the same system that used force is also the system that investigates it, skepticism grows, especially when political leaders move first, declaring justification, declaring closure. Before all facts are known, that sequence changes everything. It narrows outcomes, it signals expectations, and it sends a message not just to investigators, but to the public watching. If accountability depends on independence, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who is left to provide it? And how does this moment land on people far from this street? That is where the impact truly begins. Now, bring this closer. Imagine you are watching this unfold from your phone, not as a lawyer, not as an official, but as a citizen. You see the videos, you hear the statements, and you feel the gap between them. That gap creates fear, because it suggests that explanations arrive faster than answers. You start to wonder how power would treat you. On a street, in your neighborhood, in a moment you cannot rewind, this is how trust erodes. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in quiet doubts, accumulating. You don't need to choose sides to feel it. You just need to sense that the process feels closed. If you've ever asked yourself whether accountability still works when force is federal, this moment speaks to you directly. Stay with me, because this is not just about Minneapolis. What happens next reaches far beyond one city. What happens in one city rarely stays there. Federal authority does not stop at state lines. Neither do its consequences. When national agencies act, they send signals across the country to local governments, to law enforcement, to communities already living with uncertainty. This case lands in a moment of heightened tension. Immigration enforcement is no longer abstract policy. It is visible, physical, present in everyday spaces. When force is used and accountability appears constrained, the ripple spreads. Cities ask how much authority they truly have. States ask where their role ends. And abroad, the United States is still watched closely, not for perfection, but for process. How power explains itself matters. How it investigates itself matters more, because credibility is cumulative, built slowly, lost quickly. If democratic systems rely on restraint and transparency, then moments like this test more than policy. They test whether federal power can coexist with local trust. And that brings us to the hardest question. What happens next? The answer depends on the path forward. The future now splits into three paths. The first is the best case. Transparency expands, questions are answered publicly, procedures are clarified, not to assign blame, but to restore confidence. In this scenario, institutions slow down, they allow scrutiny, and they accept that legitimacy depends on openness. The second path is more familiar. Partial disclosure, limited accountability, enough information to close the case. Not enough to settle public doubt. Life moves on, but unease remains. The third path is the most dangerous. Silence, defensiveness, and precedent. A message that force is final and explanation optional. Over time, this path hardens. It reshapes expectations. People stop asking questions, not because they are satisfied, but because they believe answers will not come. History shows this pattern clearly. Trust does not vanish overnight. It thins. Which future emerges depends on choices made now, and on whether accountability is treated as a burden or as the price of power. That choice leads us to the final insight. Every democracy makes a quiet promise. That power will explain itself, that force will be restrained, and that no authority stands above questioning. This case is not just about one officer or one decision or one city. It is about whether that promise still holds when the stakes are highest. Because once force is used, the burden shifts, not to the citizen, but to the state. Silence is not neutrality. Speed is not transparency. And certainty declared too early is not justice. If institutions want trust, they must earn it in moments exactly like this, by opening doors, by allowing scrutiny, by accepting that legitimacy comes from being questioned, not protected from it. What happens next will shape more than a case file. It will shape expectations. If you want to understand how power is changing, how accountability is narrowing or expanding, and what this means for the future of authority in America, stay with me. Because this story is not over, and the next one is already unfolding.